Hi everybody. This is a short presentation about chapters 5 and 6 in our text, selected response and written response. Our learning target for these chapters are that you should be able to develop and evaluate high quality selected response items and written response assessment items. To develop either selected or written response, the authors lay out a procedure or a process that's fairly similar for both. So first things first is you're going to think about how am I going to be using this assessment and who is going to be using the data that I'm collecting, how many items do I want. That is step number one. And then step number two is identifying your learning targets that you're going to be wanting to assess using these items. You want to make sure that your learning targets are related to knowledge or reasoning, because those are the items that selected response and written response items are appropriate for either knowledge learning targets or reasoning learning targets. And then you want to decide how many items for each learning target that you're going to need to develop. That's the sample size. So, for example, if you spent most of your unit on some of your learning targets and then only a day or two on one of the other learning targets, then you're not going to want to, then you're going to want to have a similar proportion of test items for the learning targets that you spent more time on in class. And then once you decide how many items you're going to want on your test for each of the learning targets, then you want to develop propositions that are related to those learning targets. And this part of the chapter I think is pretty important because it requires you as the teacher to think about your content and think, okay, what's the most important facts or concepts that I'm expecting the students to know about this learning target, and to state those very clearly. And those sentences or statements, those are your propositions, and those are what you're going to be able to use to develop your test bank for the selected response items. So the authors recommend that you develop more propositions than you need, and that way you can, if you end up using your same assessment more than one semester in a row, you can always replace some of your items, or if you find that some of your items are weaker than others, then you can cut out the weaker ones if you have plenty to choose from. For items that ask students to interpret things, then you're going to need to have the text or the visual or the graphic that they're interpreting along with the proposition. And on page 133, the authors have a nice table that summarizes each type of selected response type, which are multiple choice, true, false, matching, and fill in the blank. Sorry, I don't think I mentioned that earlier. And it kind of explains briefly when you would use each of those selected response item types and what are the advantages and disadvantages of each of those item types. So on our formative activities for this week, the first part of our Google Doc is a selected response knowledge check, about this chapter. And on that, I would like for you to answer each item and then evaluate each item as well. If it's good, great, or if it needs improvement, I'd like you to note why that item has a problem and use evidence from our text. And there's a selected response test item quality checklist, on page 146 that can help you out. So here's my example of a poorly written selected response item. Which of the following are examples of mammals? And I want you to think, what's wrong with this problem? So thing number one, maybe I should have picked more unknown mammals or something. Maybe a little bit more challenging than dogs and cats. But the other problem is that the question asks for a plural and answer B is the only plural response, so that could be a giveaway. So in the chapter, they give you several things to watch out for in terms of developing good selected response items. They ask you to make sure that the different answers that your students are selecting from are plausible, unless you really want to give them, a throwaway response, but make sure that your STEM is written as a complete question. Make sure that the answers are parallel to one another and that words in the question are not also the same as the words in the answers, if that makes sense. In any case, they give you, like I said, on page 146, a nice checklist to remember all of those different things, and you can look over your own items as you're creating items. If you're creating selected response items for your CBA, you can use that checklist to make sure that your items are good. And that's what I'd like for you to do for the first part of our formative assessment materials for this week, or for this lesson today. Okay, so that's selected response assessment. One other thing that I just want to quickly mention is the aspect of the chapter that discusses using the selected response items for learning with students. And I thought they have some good recommendations here for getting your students involved in reflecting on the learning target, which selected response items went along with which learning targets and which ones that they missed. And that way your students can also, again, be taking more ownership for their assessment of their own learning. And I thought that was kind of a cool thing to keep in mind with these kinds of assessments. Okay, so Chapter 6 discusses developing written response assessment items, and like I said, the planning part is very similar for both selected response and written response. They ask you to think about, your learning targets, think about your sample size, how many items do you want for each learning target, and then you want to think about, okay, am I looking for a short, brief response? Am I looking for something that needs a little bit more explanation, which would probably be some of those reasoning learning targets, where you're asking students to maybe compare and contrast or something along those lines? Or is this going to be asking them to interpret data, interpret a text? And that might also require a written response. When developing written response items, the authors recommend that you set the context, be very clear with students as to what they're going to describe or explain, and then point the way to an appropriate response and show them, okay, like for this example, I'm going to be giving 1 point for a clear definition of acceleration, 2 points for factors that affect acceleration, and then if you can also explain how each factor affects, that's another 2 points. So this also helps you as the teacher begin to develop your scoring guide, which is the second part of the developing written response items. So first you have to develop the items, and then you have to think about, okay, how am I going to know whether this response represents a limited response, a partial response, or a fully developed response? So you're going to have to come up with a scoring guide for your written response items. There's a lot of many examples that are provided in the chapter, so you could take a look at those, but we'll talk more about creating rubrics for performance-based assessment in the next lesson. Okay, so now it's your turn. I'd like you to go ahead to the Google Doc. It's going to prompt you to make a copy of it. When you click on the link, you can put your name here, and then the first part of it is the selected response knowledge check, and then the second part of it is asking you to create your own selected response and written response items. I provided an example in case it's helpful. You can look at my example if you like, or you can delete my example. Either way, when you're ready to write your own, do delete my content and include your own examples. You're going to have your clarifying your objective, your standard and your clarifying objectives, your learning targets, and then you're going to develop propositions based on those learning targets. And using the propositions, you're going to create selected response items and written response items for this lesson. Okay, thanks a lot for